Well, with that video montage of what has been an extremely eventful year thus far, in fact, an extremely eventful last 4 years, it is my honor to welcome you to the Perth US Asia Center program on Indo-Pacific Perspectives on the United States presidential election. I am delighted today to be welcomed by a number of leaders throughout our region here in the Indo-Pacific who have kindly agreed to join us to share their reactions to the news that we just watched and that we continue living at this point. We're going to be joined first and foremost by Ambassador Chan Heng-chi. She's the Ambassador at Large at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. She spent 16 years as Singapore's ambassador to Washington, D.C., functioning effectively as the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps there. And she's not peripatetic, I would say she's omnipresent. And we're very fortunate to have her with us today to share her perspectives. We're hopeful that we're going to be joined by Ambassador Fujisaki Ichiro from Tokyo, Japan, who also served as Japan's ambassador to Washington, D.C., but he's still in the process of signing on right now. We'll let you know once we manage to secure him. We're also delighted to have a close friend of the Perth US Asia Centers and a frequent collaborator, Ambassador Dino Paddy Jalal, who's the co-founder of the Foreign Policy Community Indonesia. He served as Deputy Foreign Minister for Indonesia, as well as their ambassador to Washington, D.C. I think well known to audiences throughout the region, and we're delighted to have him with us. From India, we're welcomed by Ms. Suhasini Haidar, who is the diplomatic editor of The Hindu, one of India's oldest and most respected dailies. She is well known to audiences throughout the region from her long presence in both print media and in broadcast media. She served as the anchor for CNN, IBN rather, as well as a correspondent for CNN International, and just had a wonderful op-ed released today in The Hindu looking at Indian perspectives on the election of Joe Biden to the U.S. presidency. And then last but certainly not least, back here at home, we're delighted to be joined by Melissa Babbage. Melissa is back from 4 years in Washington, D.C. She serves as Vice Chairman of the American Australian Association, is currently Director at Swiss Re, and has a long career in finance, including at Deutsche Bank. And so we're delighted to have truly something that we hope to provide at the Perth US Asia Center, which is a regional perspective on these developments. As we've seen in that short video montage as people were signing into this call, there is no shortage of information or perspectives about what's happening in Washington, D.C. We hope to provide a little bit of value-added perspectives by, instead of focusing on what's happening, by focusing on our regional reactions to that. So what I'd like to do is, turning to this august panel that we have, and starting first with Ambassador Chan Heng-chi, ask each of our panelists just to give us the reaction from their own national perspectives. So Ambassador Chan, could you tell us how these developments are being viewed in Singapore?
Well, thank you, Gordon, and thank you for the invitation. Well, let me say that I think we are relieved that, the election has come to an end and there is, I think, a result. There's some clarity, although there are some challenges, but I believe there is clarity. Let me say that from Singapore's perspective, Singapore has always worked with both parties, Republicans and Democrats. And I'm not saying this as a diplomat, it's the truth. Because we started, for instance, a free trade agreement with the Democratic President Bill Clinton. And it was actually carried out and negotiated fully under the Republican President George W. Bush. So we've worked with Republicans and Democrats. And during the time of President Obama and now with President Trump, we've maintained a solid and substantial relationship. In fact, we deepened our strategic framework agreement, which is a defense cooperation during the Trump administration. And we have also deepened defense cooperation in another way. We've also started negotiating the digital economy agreement. So we work well with the United States. That said, I think we are looking for a predictable and reliable power in the region. And we like our partners. We like the United States to be predictable and reliable. And most of all, we want to see a stable US-China relationship in the region, because the US-China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, and it impacts enormously on the entire region of East Asia, Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific.
Ambassador Chan, wonderfully diplomatic as always. I must confess, the two words reliable and predictable are probably not ones that people would broadly apply to the last 4 years, but they set a really interesting premise for our conversation going forward. We're going to turn next to Indonesia, Indonesian perspectives. Pak Dino, can we go over to you to get the reaction from Jakarta?
Okay, good. So I want to thank America for giving us great entertainment for the past year or so. I stopped watching Netflix and listening to Spotify. It's really, you know, a lot of laughs, a lot of tears, a lot of drama. So thank you for that. I'm going to miss that very much, yeah, the whole family. And secondly, a response to U.S. elections, there are two kinds, yeah. On the public side, yes, there's relief, but there hasn't been much affection for President Trump. Yeah, I think this is particularly true among the Islamic community in Indonesia. And remember, there was 1 million people march in Indonesia, and by the Muslims community to protest against Trump's policies. And there has not been, you know, anything like that for a while. So Trump was a hard sell for Indonesia. But for the government, like what Ambassador Henke said, you know, the relations are, for us, we maintain the relations. There's a strategic partnership on paper, at least. But you can see that the U.S. diplomatic and political and economic capital in Indonesia has declined, and the relations under Obama was definitely not as close as it was under under Trump, was definitely not as close as under Obama. And this is why Indonesians welcome Biden presidency. You know, Trump was seen as not being friendly to Muslims, but Biden, you know, he sent a special message to the Islamic voters in the United States that went viral in Indonesia. And you know, Biden was seen as the number 2 for Obama, which was seen as very pro Indo-Pacific, you know, pro Asia, pro Southeast Asia, and pro Indonesia. So there's a lot that can be you know, utilized or harnessed from that in terms of Biden presidency's relationship with Southeast Asia, and including with Indonesia.
Thank you. Suhasini, President Trump had a rather high-profile visit to Delhi, and likewise, Prime Minister Modi was engaged in a Howdy Modi big rally there in Texas. So India is a little bit different. Could you kind of give us the perspective from Delhi?
Sure, and while there will be some similarities, you know, the idea that Mr. Trump was unpredictable, as in general, I would say that there is a feeling that is not very negative towards Mr. Trump as he goes out. Look, at the end of the day, the idea that relations are bipartisan on both sides, regardless of who comes to power in India and regardless of who comes to power in the US, strategic ties have actually grown year on year for the last 20 years. We haven't seen them walk back at all. But even so, the election result is a bit of a mixed bag for the government in New Delhi, the Narendra Modi government, as you pointed out. On the one hand, Mr. Modi himself personally invested in the relationship. There was a lot of phone calls between him and Mr. Trump for events in the last year. And remember, this was election year in the US. So normally not according to protocol to have such a deep investment with the government in Washington. But even so, we saw a rally in Houston. We saw a rally in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad in February this year, just a few months before. We also saw ties with the Democrats strain a little bit because of, you know, the External Affairs Minister, you know, snubbing the Democrats, refusing to go to a House Foreign Affairs Committee. We saw Mr. Pompeo make his last visit, as he did to Indonesia as well, just a week before elections, which internally was seen as more or less a signal that the government somehow thought that this government would be re-elected. It's also true that Mr. Trump's nativist platform, majoritarian policies match at present with the policies of the current government in India. And finally, Mr. Trump was good for India on a whole bunch of things. The Indo-Pacific that he put a lot of investment into in the last year. He was tough on Pakistan, which always goes down well in India. He really was tough on China, particularly at a time when India is facing the kind of aggression that we are at the line of actual control. This made a big difference. And finally, India was a beneficiary of the fact that Mr. Trump didn't put his traditional alliances first. The US was open to dealing with all kinds of countries that weren't traditional allies. And in a sense, India was a beneficiary of that and liked the fact that Mr. Trump did not have this interventionist policy. In fact, he ended America's wars, if you like, in many spheres rather than start any new ones. So I know that's not normally what is seen in so many other parts of the world. On the other hand, India does have a lot to look forward to with Mr. Biden. The government, or New Delhi, the establishment, has dealt with Mr. Biden for decades now. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Vice President of the US. He was sent out especially to look at Afghanistan policy. He's likely to have less sudden starts. He's not going to call up one day and say, I'm withdrawing India's GSP exporter status, as Mr. Trump did. And most importantly, he's likely to rejoin the multilateral structure. This is what Mr. Biden wrote in an article in Foreign Policy earlier this year: restore US leadership and possibly rejoin all the things Mr. Trump walked out for. Although I don't know if he'll have the time to do them, but UNESCO, Human Rights Council, WHO, rejoining Paris Climate Accord will help India, rejoining the Iran nuclear negotiations, again, will ease things for India in the region. I think broadly, India will welcome the return to old-fashioned values, if you like, that Mr. Biden represents, the democratic values, but will be prickly about the US taking any kind of intrusive interest towards India's own domestic, democratic issues, issues with Kashmir, alleged human rights violations, laws that have been controversial, and all the rest.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted we were able to work out the technical difficulties, and we're now joined by Ambassador Fujisaki Ichiro, who serves as president of the Nakasone Peace Institute, had been ambassador in Washington, D.C. as well as being a distinguished professor at Sophia University. So, Ambassador Fujisaki, what we're asking is just a short reaction from Japan as Japanese perspectives on the election.
We are very happy that the U.S. would be coming back as a worldly leader, and that's very important for us. And we're very happy that there's not too much violence, and because the U.S. should be a role model for democracy. Now, very frankly, if Mr. Trump had won, we would say, hey, glad to work with you for next 4 years. And if Mr. Biden is coming back, we'd say, it's nice to work with you, because it's American people's decision. It's not ours. So I was always saying it's like a Christmas gift. We don't open the box and we don't say anything till the day we open the box and cry out, oh, this is just what I wanted. That's the only solution. So we're very happy. And one thing, Henshi is a very big sister for all of us. So I feel like a little brother talking back to my big sister. But when I heard her, I think she missed one word: firm attitude. I think, of course, we need US-China stability, but also I think for human rights, for values, democracy, I think firm attitude that US has been taken should be appreciated as well. And I think that is something we would continue to, that Americans would take that attitude. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Now we're going to turn to you, Melissa. You've had a rather unique experience on this panel, and that all the rest of us are somewhat removed from Washington. You've spent the last 4 years there, have both a business kind of view on some of these issues, given your role as vice chair of the American Australian Association, but you are now back in Sydney. So could you kind of characterize the Australian reaction to the results that we're watching right now?
So a quick thank you, Gordon, and it's great to be on the panel with such esteemed colleagues. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I think from the perspective of the Australian public, there is also the relief that we seem to have some clarity and some form of result. I think there is a great curiosity from the Australian public and probably some assumptions too as to what the domestic cultural landscape might evolve into or might look like over the next few years. And whether that in fact will bear out or not, I think is something to be seen. There's perhaps, some not deep enough understanding of just the difference in the demographics of the US. And the closeness really of the result. I mean, it's 4 million votes or something, really does, speak to some of those kind of differences and divides across the United States. So that's something I think that from a domestic perspective, the ordinary Australian, if you want to put it that way, is really interested to see how that plays out. I think from a national perspective, obviously we continue to have the willingness to work from the foundation of shared values. That's really important. It's been ever thus, and it will continue to be that way. The values, the belief systems are very, very important. Like a couple of the other panelists have mentioned, I think, again, from a national perspective, we would have an expectation and probably a hope for greater multilateral engagement from the US. We definitely need, I think, support through the various alliances and the various multilateral bodies in order to really embed a rules-based operating model for the Indo-Pacific. So we look forward to kind of developments in that area. For example, from an Australian perspective, we obviously hope that a body like the WTO will get the support it needs to again be effective as the world's primary trade referee. So I think there's some of the main, thinking from a national perspective. And also one of the other panelists had mentioned we would see that perhaps the Biden administration will look more closely at issues around human rights and, potentially how that impacts supply chains, throughout the region. And those supply chains obviously form a really critical part of the relationship with the United States going forward. So yeah, that's just a few of the thoughts that are, I think, swirling around our nation at the moment.
Thank you so much. As to underline this kind of first series of questions, it's quite interesting to me that despite the fact that President Trump has yet to concede, after the US networks had all called the election, every one of the countries that are joining our panel today, so Indonesia, Japan, India, Australia, and Singapore, have all had national leaders who have reached out in public and congratulated the president-elect Joe Biden and his running mate Kamala Harris. And so that in itself kind of underlines so many of the comments that we've already just heard thus far. Now, one of the challenges the United States is facing right now is that it is still in the middle of a pandemic. In fact, a pandemic that appears to be peaking right during the election. If I understand correctly, today alone there were 134,000 new cases of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it does seem that any incoming administration, so when the Biden administration does take power, which seems to be 3 long months away right now, they're going to be overwhelmed with the enormity of the challenges in terms of health, in terms of economic recovery. And I can't help but reflect back a number of years ago. I had the honor of serving on the Asia advisory team in a minor role at the time for the Obama campaign in 2008. And at the time, Ambassador Chan Heng-chi hosted a large number of people from the campaign to discuss the events during the course of the campaign and where we're looking at. And the conclusion we all had at that point was the United States facing this 2008 financial crisis was not going to have the bandwidth for foreign policy. And in some respects, that proved to be true, right? The first focus was on rebuilding the economy domestically. We're likely to face a similar situation right now, where the U.S. is going to be focusing on rebuilding strength at home. So in that context, I want to go back to our panelists and ask you, from a Singaporean perspective, an Indonesian perspective, Indian, Japanese, or Australian perspective, if you were to be giving advice to a very distracted Biden administration that has dealing with a lot of other issues, what are the issues that you would like to see them focus on as a priority to strengthen relations with Singapore, Indonesia, India, Japan, Australia in turn? So Ambassador Chan, we're going to return to you, if you could.
Thank you, Gordon. Gordon, before I go to your question, there's one point that I would like to make, which I don't think any of us made in the first round, but I think it's very important. And that is between now and January 20th, I hope, nothing too excitable or exciting happens, and there are not too many initiatives that have to be unwound. And that is, I think, a real concern, what could, be done, which would be difficult to undo. Now, putting that aside, what would we like to see sorted out? You are absolutely right to say that, and in fact, Joe Biden, in the article that Suhasini referred to, he wrote a piece on foreign policy in foreign affairs, where it's very clear the focus is domestic concerns, and I think that will happen, and he will have to make COVID and the recovery from COVID his first priority. So foreign policy is not going to be front and center. And I would say I'm very realistic, and Southeast Asia is really not going to be front and center. So my message is, please, put some attention to Southeast Asia. I think bearing in mind that foreign policy is a little harder to carry through, it is important that the United States makes sure that you have officials appointed, because during the Trump administration, there weren't many officials appointed to fill in the slots, to carry on the business of the state. That it was very thin, the State Department and other departments too. Now, hopefully, if you have people staffed in different departments, ministries for us, you can at least get business done at different levels. So that would be very important. I think in Asia, we place great emphasis on being there. You have to be there. And I do not know how the Trump administration is going to carry this when they are so absorbed at home. But it is important to have an exchange of visits to understand our perspectives. During these 4 years, I'm not sure many of us were getting our views through sufficiently. No, we did things, but does the United States really have a feel of what the people in our region want? So it's very important for American officials and even American business, I would say. They should play it as a whole of government, come together and understand what the region wants. Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia. Meet and exchange to build a relationship. I think the United States must make up its mind to attend the summits that they are, in fact, a member of. The East Asian Summit, APEC, ARF, etc. Not just summits, but other meetings. So be present at the meetings. We will work on climate change with the United States, and we will work on the pandemic, a global health security matter. I think we can all work on that. We would like to work on trade, and we would like to see the United States come back to trade in a big way. But I do understand it is harder. There's CPTPP. And would the United States come back to it? And I know there are some obstacles. We took out 22 provisions, and for the US to come back, do you insist the 22 provisions be brought back to CPTPP? I think those are questions that we would be interested. I can go on, but I better let others have a say. But so we'll work on climate change. We want attention on foreign affairs, but we know how hard it is going to be. Look at climate change, global health security, and if you can, and I know trade is not a priority, but you have to start looking at trade.
Well, thank you. I mean, and it's a wonderful reminder that international relations ultimately are about relationships. And one of the first questions I think that everyone in this panel is going to be looking at is to who is going to be filling these key positions in the Biden administration, because that was one of the things that I think Ambassador Chan has rightly pointed out that characterized the last 4 years, just a remarkably thin bench in terms of people in those positions. So that's very helpful. So Pak Dino, we're going to go over to you from an Indonesian perspective. If you were to give advice, and you're never shy about these things, what would you like Washington to be focusing on? What should Jakarta be doing to strengthen that bilateral relationship?
Well, first, I'm sure the rest of the world understands that Biden has to get COVID-19 and the economy under control. He does not want to be like Bush 41, successful on foreign policy and then got defeated at home because of economic conditions. And I think on foreign policy, Biden can take advantage of the fact that many of the foreign policy wonks that refuse to work for President Trump, they signed that petition. I don't know if you signed that as well, Gordon. But, these guys are all up for grabs and they can quickly move into foreign policy structure. But I do want to point out that, look, if the United States wants to increase its influence and role in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, I agree with Heng Chi. You gotta play the part, right? I remember a conversation with the late Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. I was the note taker, and my president was speaking to him, and his point was, look, in the relationship between nations, economics is very important. Economics is the weight of that relationship, right? And you can see that in Indonesia's case, for example, US-Indonesia trade has remained stagnant for about a decade at about 26 to 29 billion. Whereas with China, it's already 70 billion and soon reaching 100 billion, right? So US-Indonesia trade is 1/3 of China, right? And that reveals to you that the United States has to step up the game on trade, on investment, and education, technology, and other things, right? So I think, my point is, look, there's a Biden presidency, but it's not automatic that United States will have a seat on the table the way it had before. You have to re-earn that place at the table, right? You got to be present. You got to come up with policies that engage and lead countries in the region, and so on and so on, right? So it's not going to be automatic. There's got to be some work that has to be put into it.
Fantastic. Well, one of the advantages and disadvantages of living in Perth, the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington, D.C., is that despite the many Never Trump letters, I was never even asked to sign on to one. So we're a little bit out of sight, out of mind down here in that process. We're going to turn to you next, Suhasini, from India's perspective. What would you be urging in terms of focus and priorities?
Sure, and of course, Gordon, with the disclaimer, unlike so many of the distinguished panelists, I'm a journalist, so I'm not even sure my own side would take my recommendations. But I will say that I agree with Ambassador Chan completely. I don't know how quickly foreign policy can become a real priority for Mr. Biden, given the domestic challenges he faces and the need to deal with the vast polarization that we have seen, not just in the election, but in terms of what is following now with Mr. Trump still hesitant to concede, if you like. So I would say pluck the low-hanging fruit when it comes to foreign policy, and particularly for India-US policies. I would say there are a lot of low-hanging fruit that Mr. Biden could look at. One is to conclude some kind of a mini trade deal. This has been the subject of negotiations between the US trade representative and the Indian Commerce Minister for more than a year, in fact, 2 years or so. They haven't gotten anywhere, but we keep hearing that they're close. So a little bit of flexibility on both sides would produce a mini trade deal, which will make a difference. The second, and I say this because I'm not a diplomat, there must be US clarity on China. The world cannot be sitting around waiting for that next tweet to come that says, today I'm on good terms with China. Today I think Mr. Xi is a great guy. The next day, China's going to pay and all the rest of that. We are all too invested in the United States and invested in China. And, Ambassador Dino really did put out the kind of investment comparisons, and those comparisons exist for all of Asia. To be swinging like some pendulum and deciding, what to do about policies depending on where the US is. So the US should be clear where they want to go. Are they looking for more brinkmanship of the kind we saw in the Trump administration? Are we looking at possibilities of a resolution to the US problems with China right now? I think that is something that that will make a big difference to India and to others in Asia. I think because Gordon didn't say who those recommendations were to specifically, I would say that for the Indian government, it is necessary to start reaching out institutionally to the US rather than falling back into some of the personality-driven style we have seen of pushing ties, the hugs, the rallies, and all the rest of that, and to really look now at a Biden administration as the anti-Trump, if you like, where you are not going to get as far by doing just the personal things. I think India should be prepared for dealing with sensitive issues and to have frank conversations, as democracies do, with each other on those issues. And finally, and I forgot this in the low-hanging fruit I was talking about, Mr. Biden needs to make, put out the statement of American openness a little more clearly. This doesn't have to mean more visas or easier visas, because everybody understands, particularly in a post-COVID world, we're looking at much more closed environments for migration. But the US stands to lose its soft power if it looks like a forbidding or unwelcoming country to the rest of the world, where it is seen, as Mr. Biden put it, at its best, it is seen as a beacon for the world. So I would say that's another low-hanging fruit, which will be appreciated very much in New Delhi as well.
Thank you. Ichiro, Japan has the double whammy of dealing with a relatively new prime minister, but also this upcoming change of government here. What would you focus on in terms of that bilateral relationship?
Thank you. First of all, Gordon-san, the most boring panel, I think, is that where panelists all agree. So I'll may sound like a devil's advocate, but I'd like to challenge what Chan Hen-chi said and what Haidar-san said. I'm quite optimistic about the foreign policy side. Of course, the first issue is COVID-19, but four reasons. One, he had been chairman of Foreign Relations Committee for so long. That's his priority, he knows people, he has all the expertise, Iran deal, TPP, everything. Point two, in order to compete, I don't say confront, but compete with Russia and China and those countries, you need like-minded countries. And I think Indo-Pacific strategy, you call it Asia-Pacific or whatever, will continue to be very important, and I think he will try to reach out to allies and like-minded countries. Third, I think because this administration, not like Trump administration, would like to do the team play, not only him, the leader, but others, state secretary or a national security advisor or USTR, all would play the game. And so playing the team play will be the element. And a lot of us, Chan Hen-chi or Gordon-san or Dino-san, all these players on the Democratic Party. The fourth reason, I think, would be that it was during the Obama administration that ASEAN Secretariat, the representative in Jakarta, and they know, and they were coming to ASEAN Summit, unlike Mr. Trump. So I think we could be optimistic. Now, one thing I would like United States do is they have to know that they are elephant. She's an elephant. So we want quiet walk, not dancing around, because we all need predictability, stability, and I think we can expect that on the Biden team more than what we are seeing with the Trump team. And we have a new prime minister, and he's going to establish good relations with the new president. So he, as you just sent a cable right away, and looking forward to. I think if it was Mr. Abe, he was very good in establishing good relations, excellent relations with Mr. Trump. But maybe Mr. Trump would have, I'm sorry, Mr. Abe may have hesitated to sending a message today or yesterday too early, but that was possible, and I think we look forward to making good relations. And I think foreign relations would be very important element for the new team, and especially in the Pacific region, Asia Pacific region. This is the growth center. Thank you. Very much. Sorry for a long talk.
No, not at all. Melissa, I mean, arguably, Australia has probably managed the admittedly challenging relationships with the Trump administration better than any other U.S. ally in the world. If you look at Canada or NATO or disputes over funding with South Korea or even in Japan. And so that bilateral relationship has remained remarkably strong and well managed by the last several governments in Australia. That makes the question of what next a little bit more difficult. How do you view that?
Everything that you said is true. But I think if we look to the future, we start from a really solid platform. And like I said previously, we start from a very solid base of shared values. And of course, the Five Eyes Security Partnership is, a very important part of the relationship. Now, President Biden has had actually more engagement with Australia than had President Trump, of course, when he won. President Biden had visited many, many times, and there's lots of engagement with Australian officials and through many different iterations of ministries and so forth. And also, President-elect Biden's team, his administration, is likely to include many people that have engaged with Australia already in various capacities. We don't know who exactly that might be, but for example, Jeff Bleich, the former US ambassador to Australia, might be engaged in the new administration. Michelle Flournoy, from a defence perspective. There are some, long-standing personal relationships with Australia, notwithstanding that the current government and governments of all iterations have shown themselves over time to be able to form good and deep relationships with the United States. I think in terms of strengthening relations, I agree with everything that has been said around the domestic focus, and I think about, well, what does President-elect Biden want his legacy to be? And without being so presumptuous as to put thoughts into his head or think that I have some super insight, but two things that are quite obvious. One is climate change, and the other, of course, is what he himself has termed the soul of the nation. And I think from the climate change perspective, I do think that, that will be one of the early pillars of re-engagement, if we want to call it re-engagement, in the multilateral kind of field. And that is the Paris Accord. And so that is something that we will need to work with the US on that accord. And so whilst the president and his team, the administration, will be caught up for a while looking at the COVID, the domestic economic issues. I always am very optimistic about the US and its ability to recover from its domestic economic kind of situation. And so I think, you know, so I do think there will be some focus around President-elect Biden and his own thinking about, you know, what do I want to achieve as president? And for sure, you know, there are aspects that are globally significant. We need to keep, from an Australian perspective, you know, we need to keep embedding things like the developments in the Five Eyes partnerships. We need, it's, you know, it's gone deeper into other industries, including critical minerals and supply chains, and we need to keep embedding this. And we also, you know, need to, I think, continue to work through the Quad in a very constructive fashion. And so those aspects of foreign policy, I think are important, and where we will be continuing to work to strengthen our relations and keep them on the good foundation that we do have.
Well, thank you. Well, if I can make an observation, one of the underlying presumptions by using big terms like initially Asia Pacific, or our favorite term sitting here in Australia's Indian Ocean capital, the Indo-Pacific, is that the issues that we discuss no longer are things that can be handled individually or even bilaterally. And so it was interesting to me that almost to a person, as we went through our panel and we talked about what needed to be bilaterally, the conversation quickly strayed into the regional or even the global, whether it was participation in fora such as the East Asia Summit, or resumption of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or leadership on trade, or leadership on climate change, or leadership on health. The bilateral requires the regional. So I want to kind of wrap up on that. We've just got a little over 10 minutes left, but I want to take a moment to step back and say, okay, and again, Melissa did a wonderful job of kind of saying, all right, what does he want his legacy to be? So let me kind of frame it that way. If we look at this broad enterprise, which is, you know, an expansive, additive, positive narrative, how do we incorporate India into the Asia Pacific? How do we build an Indo-Pacific which is based on what Australians will refer to as a rules-based order, the rule of law, where we're expanding trade? There's a lot of challenges we've already put out on the table there. By the end of this year, we'll have a regional cooperative economic partnership agreement signed where the United States is not part of it, right? So I'm kind of curious, let me just kind of rephrase that last question a little bit differently. If we have a vision for the region, for the Indo-Pacific in the next 4 years, what do we want the U.S. role to be in that region? What do we want the U.S. role, or perhaps legacy 4 years hence, to be in the Indo-Pacific? So Heng-Chi, we're going to go back to you at the very top again, if we could.
You know, Gordon, I think that one of the things the United States must be aware of, and the region is certainly very aware of, is that things are different now. A lot of things have changed. The world has changed, and we are moving into a multipolar world. The United States had a bipolar world, then it was a unipolar world, and it's, you know, sort of a unipolar in the Asia Pacific. But I think that is changing. It's multipolar, but at the moment, it is asymmetrical multipolar. Asymmetrical pole being the United States. But China is catching up soon, and India wants to catch up too. Japan wants to play a role, Australia wants to play a role, so it's a multipolar world. And so the United States needs to come in and talk to people, talk to the countries. They all have their ideas. The Indo-Pacific idea was pushed, but you know, at the last Indo-Pacific meet, the countries all had very different ideas, and I don't think they had the same view, and I think there wasn't a communique. You know, some countries wanted an inclusive Indo-Pacific. Australia thinks of Indo-Pacific more inclusively. It's not to exclude any country. So I think, you know, the United States has to come in. You can lead or co-lead with everybody, but to form an Asia Indo-Pacific community where we all want it rules-based, but better when you talk to everybody and don't try containment, because nobody in Asia wants the US to force us to choose. Once you talk of choosing, nobody wants to play that game. So I would say these are some of the changes, and I think that could be the legacy. And Biden could do that, because I think the United States would like to work with China where they can, cooperate with China where they can, and confront where they must. But there's room for working together. And I think that's the legacy.
Thank you. Dino, over to you.
You know, now the flavor of the day is Indo-Pacific, right? I'm just a bit worried if Indo-Pacific is being framed as a US-led movement, then it's going to be harder to find traction in the region, right? Because we see how there's a lot of regional designs in the region, the East Asia Summit, you know, RCEP and other things. It all happens because it's not being pushed by one major power, right? So that's just one thing. United States can promote it, but I agree with Heng Chi. You have to know when you don't have to be in the front lead, yeah. And secondly, I think it's important for the US to be seen as a solution provider to the challenges of the region. You know, this is how China has gained some traction, because China has been seen more as a solution provider on some issues, right? And that's why their diplomatic capital has increased in the recent years. And the United States has to also project and present itself in the same way, right? And I think if it does that, you know, I don't know if it's about connectivity, infrastructure, and other issues, then I think President Biden's foreign policy would be in the stronger hands. Yeah.
Thanks. I would note that despite my funny Arizona accent, sitting here in Perth as I am, one of the advantages of a panel like this is it's not driven out of Washington, D.C., and we're able to bring together perspectives from Japan and India and Australia, which have long had Indo-Pacific policies, Singapore, which has been greatly facilitative of all the dialogues in this region, and of course Indonesia, which recently led the formation of an ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook. And so we appreciate that very much. Suhasini, over to you.
Well, you know, Gordon, the remarks on this panel really reflect that we are all thinking on the same lines and the same concerns. I do think Mr. Biden, if he is looking to build this Indo-Pacific, you know, as a region that is cohesive, needs to think out of the box a little bit, maybe even take a leaf, dare I say it, from the Trump book. Because there are things that Mr. Trump did in terms of non-traditional structures that a future administration could learn. Cooperation between Indo-Pacific countries and the US that we haven't seen before in this particular format. You have things like the Five Eye meeting that included a few others, including India more recently. And again, these are ways of thinking out of the box if you do want to come closer to this and bring this region together. The second, and I think Ambassador Dino put it very well, that there must be a US alternative. So far, we have spoken about the Indo-Pacific, and particularly if you look at the India, US, Japan, Australia, the Quad, it has really focused on the strategic, on the military exchanges, on the exercises we've seen as well that have started. But they have to look at the second part, which is giving a cogent, comprehensive, sustainable alternative to countries in the region that genuinely need to develop, that genuinely need infrastructural investment, but aren't seeing any alternatives. The US, you know, had the much touted idea of the Blue Dot Network initiative. But frankly, besides being a Michelin rating sort of agency, it didn't really go far in terms of, you know, putting your money where your mouth is, if you like. So I think there must be a greater push towards actually making the idea that the alternatives will work and will count. The supply chain resilience program that Japan, Australia, and India are part of, the initiative is going to have some traction for the moment. But again, as other panelists have said it, in a world where the RCEP is ratified, I think we are going to see trading, lines really moving towards the RCEP, internally for the RCEP countries. India has decided to walk out of that. I don't know. I don't foresee a future in which India walks back in. But the truth is that that is going to become an almost primary trading relationship or architecture. And so I'd like to see how these other alternatives would work and what the US plans to do in terms of rejoining any trading structure. And finally, and I can't put it better than Ambassador Fujisaki already did, if the US is going to be the elephant in the room in all conversations of the Indo-Pacific, then don't do the dancing because the world doesn't need for the US to move faster or to think faster than the other partners in this region when it comes to what to do about this region. We don't need the US to come and create more conflict points. We need the US in this region to show that there are alternatives, to build that free and open Indo-Pacific, the rules-based order, but to encourage it in a more positive way is where I'd leave it.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're nearing the top of the hour, but I want to make sure that we get in some final observations, both from Japan and Australia. So Ichiro, over to you for any final comments you might have.
Thank you very much. I sometimes do agree with Henchi, and I think US be there. That's the most important thing. But one thing I would like to say is that US should be confident of its assertion that, and I would like them to hold the banner as high. The rule of law, that's the most important thing. I do not want US to become one of them and follow the steps of China, Chinese solution provider. No, that's not what we would like to see. And as for dancing, Haida-san said, Trump was playing the music of salsa or tango and said, hey, let's dance this like a disc jockey. We would like to dance blues or waltz very quietly, and that's what we would like to see. Now, last thing I would like to say is that what the legacy of not Biden, but Trump, is that he has shown to us that nearly 50% of Americans are following the Trump religion or Trumpists. They are Trumpists. So we have to be very careful in treating them. We shouldn't push them too far from time to time. We'd like them to come back to TPP, but that's not possible. I think we should wait. It was a bit scary looking at the election result that unlike a lot of pollsters said, Trump was fighting a very good fight, and it was a bit scary. So we need Democrats, either Republicans who are more moderate, to continue even after Biden. That was what I was thinking. Thank you very much.
You know, after the last few weeks of the campaign, I'm still trying to get images of President Trump dancing out of my head, and I'm not sure that I want images of President-elect Biden dancing in my head either. So we might leave it some of it. Melissa, over to you for final comments.
Yes, so just very quickly, I think that, again, we ask ourselves the question, what is the role and why do we want US engagement in the region? And I think we want it because of values, rule of law, frameworks, kind of foundations. We understand the development needs within the region. We think the US has a role to play in that. As Australians, we think that we need to continue, to be helpful in the Pacific, in particular through investment and foreign aid. I think we're all really just seeking this kind of new equilibrium and maybe competitive coexistence with the bigger players in the region. And we continue to believe that very strongly that it is the frameworks that we're able to put in place in the region that that really will set that up going forward. So thank you.
This has been an extremely rich discussion, and we are very grateful that experienced diplomats, journalists, opinion leaders, business leaders from Japan, from Singapore, from Indonesia, from India, and Australia have been willing to join us for this conversation. One of the disadvantages of the COVID era is we can't have you all here with us in person in Perth, but had we done that, I think we might have been distracted, one, by the beaches, and we would have had an in-person event that was stopped here today. One of the advantages of this Zoom format is that the real audience for our discussion is likely asleep right now in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And so we're confident that when we are able to release a recording of this discussion and share it with our colleagues back in Washington, D.C., there will be intense interest on the learned perspectives that we've had around the table today. So on behalf of all of us here at the Perth US Asia Center and us broadly in the Indo-Pacific region, I'd like to thank each of our panelists for your time, for your insights, and say that I think probably collectively there is a sense of optimism in the air. There's a lot of work to be done. We've done a pretty good job of identifying it, but as a region, it is our great pleasure to be part of this region and working together with all of you. So thank you. We look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.